Welcome to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. And now, here's your host, Michael Morris.
Welcome to another session of the Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy podcast series. It is a pleasure to have Lisa Mills, a consultant, a leadership guru, a person who truly understands systems change as we try to weave together different funding resources: Social Security, Medicaid home and community-based services waiver, vocational rehabilitation, and other funding sources to help individuals with significant disabilities be able to work in a competitive, integrated environment as part of an inclusive workforce. Lisa Mills, it is a pleasure to have you with us today. So let's jump into questions. This podcast series is a part of a center that is funded by NIDLR. NIDLR stands for the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. And it brings together a really outstanding group of researchers at Syracuse, Rutgers, and Harvard universities to study what is called disability inclusive employment policy. Lisa, given your years of work out in the field, working with so many people with disabilities and systems leaders, what does a disability inclusive employment policy mean to you? And why is it important to employers, to people with disabilities, to service providers, and the economy?
So for me, disability inclusive employment policy means we start with an assumption that people with disabilities will be part of the American workforce. Unfortunately, policy has, up to this point, has defined disability as an inability to work. And that's fundamentally translated to the general population assuming that what makes people with disabilities unique is that they will not be part of the workforce, and they are not part of the workforce. So when you start and you want to focus on disability inclusive employment policy, you got to start with an assumption that every person with a disability has some type of role in the American workforce. And now more than ever, we need that policy to guide us because we have a tremendous workforce shortage, and it's critical as we grow the economy in our country that people with disabilities be considered a natural part of the workforce.
So we know too that historically, and you alluded to this in your first response to a question, we know public policy continues to pose barriers to employment and economic advancement of people with disabilities. Some public policies move us forward, some are still holding us back. Can you talk a little bit about some of the policies that are inconsistent with those goals and objectives you just laid out?
Yes, I think at the root of this is the Social Security Administration definition of disability. And as I mentioned previously, the defining disability as an inability to work. In addition, what they do is define something called substantial gainful activity, and they consider that earning at this point just over $1,300 a month or $16,000 a year to be substantial gainful activity for a person with a disability. And at that point, there for many people with disabilities, there's a cliff from which they lose those Social Security benefits that they need and are left really, for me, trading one kind of poverty for another. We have not recognized that people with disabilities have a disability, but that should not result in a conclusion that they are unable to work.
Well, I think that both you and I and so many others, we've been talking for so many years about the disincentives in Social Security policy. If you had the authority, wouldn't that be great? If you have the authority to propose, whether it's congressional, legislative, or it's regulatory, or it's even just policy interpretation, what suggestions would you make to change Social Security policies? It could be others as well, to better encourage employment of people with significant disabilities.
I think you end up making people eligible for programs and services, including Social Security, based on the fact they have a disability. Take away the measurements around how poor they are or whether or not they're working, and actually create a system where we expect to invest more, not less, in a person with a disability who is part of the general workforce. I know that there is an automatic assumption by policymakers and maybe lots of taxpayers that if you create the system like that, it will cost more. But if we look really closely at the costs of people with disabilities being outside the workforce, and now including the costs to employers and business and industry of not having an adequate workforce, that is a tremendous cost. And I would argue that investing more in people with disabilities who go to work actually would cost our country less in the end and would create a lot more benefit, allowing people with disabilities to contribute back to society what they are able and what they want to contribute.
We have looked at and tried to make changes for so many years. We've created a fairly complex system. It makes it often more difficult rather than less difficult to bring together multiple parts of the systems that serve people with disabilities. I think when I look at your work, you uniquely have helped states to understand how these different funding streams can work together. We sometimes call it sequencing, sometimes it's braiding, sometimes it's blending. Those are keywords, but can you explain to our audience what they mean and then help us understand some examples of how does this come together? How does it work?
Yeah, I think the distinction between those three terms you identified is really important. I think a lot of what we still see is sequencing. It is, if you think about a relay race, where there is a baton, unfortunately, in this case, person with a disability, but one system will serve that person and attempt to help them meet their employment goals. And then they will hand them off to another system, but you will not see the two systems participating together at the same time. And typically that has not led to the number of outcomes, positive outcomes we want. Braiding is kind of the next step on the evolution that we're on here. Braiding is more like a team sport where you have multiple systems, multiple programs, providing different types of supports to a person who is pursuing or seeking to maintain or advance in competitive employment. And they do that, they each do their part simultaneously, but they do not necessarily mix resources, but they do braid them together around a person. Then we move on to what is blending. Well, blending is more like baking a cake. It involves multiple programs or systems contributing resources to a single pot of resources that's available for a person to achieve their competitive integrated employment outcomes. There's been reluctance to go to a blending type of approach. However, when you look at it from the person with the disabilities point of view, it is often the case that blending is the way that the person's most likely to get to their employment outcome.
Can you give first, what would be an example of braiding of resources to support competitive integrated employment outcomes?
Yeah, I'll start with a transition age youth, someone who's still in high school. We see now that we know that depending on that person's disability, they may have special education services from the school or a 504 plan for reasonable accommodations. At the same time, as they move towards graduation, the vocational rehabilitation system is now providing what we call pre-employment transition services to youth with disabilities in school. So those are occurring at the same time as a youth would be receiving special education services, for example. That's braiding. That's delivering two different types of services at the same time from two different systems. Blending, probably, I guess the best example might be Medicaid providing employment services, and that provider of employment services also being able to capture ticket to work payments, being able to use those payments along with Medicaid funding to provide employment supports. Ticket to work payments from the Social Security Administration, once they are earned by a provider who is assisting someone, that provider can use those dollars any way they want, and that allows for blending of resources.
This is not something that's occurring in state after state. You've continued to push hard with states. When I think about it is, and it's almost for any type of systems change, you have to find a leader. You have to find someone within one of those agencies that's willing to kind of be less risk sensitive, being ready to move the needle. Are there other key components of where in states where you're making a lot of progress? What are the critical, ingredients of the cake, if we go back to that's going to create the blending?
Well, it really is changing the culture of the people who do work directly with people with disabilities. So vocational rehabilitation counselors, special education staff in schools, case managers or support coordinators in Medicaid programs. They really need to understand what is it that they are able to do. They need to be trained on what is braiding and how can it be done. And they need to hear from leadership of their system, and those partner systems want to encourage it, that they want to see it happen. So I've seen some really good things happen around using memorandums of understanding that lay out really payment responsibility. So for years we've had memorandums of understanding, but they've been pretty non-impactful. They've been, not really getting to the meat of the problem. But when you have leadership, like you said, Michael, and they want to move the needle, you'll see MOUs come out that actually talk about payment responsibility and shared cost sharing rather than cost shifting. And when that's followed by really good chaining that brings these players together, these people work directly with people with disabilities, you can start to see them change the way they do things and begin to demonstrate how braiding can work.
I think of it as sort of when you look at these different variables, the bottom line probably always is cost. Someone has to bear responsibility for paying for the supports and services. When you talk about sequencing, braiding, blending, it's not that one agency is going to pay. It's a new approach, not so new anymore, but still not as accepted or adopted as we might like even today. Let's take as an example, you have multiple funding streams who are required to be payers of last resort. You probably can explain what that means. But I think often what has been put into multiple federal statutes is we're the ones who pay last, so leave us alone. Go work it out with the other agencies. Explain payer of last resort, and how are you getting folks to really embrace the notion of braiding and even sometimes blending of resources?
Well, I think by helping them recognize that the investments they are making are not leading to the outcomes they want, and to help them recognize that if they actually could leverage another system and share responsibility for payment and better meet the needs of the person with a disability, better address what they need to be successful, that ultimately everybody gets a successful outcome. Nobody's had to pay the entire cost, and the braiding of the resources actually creates a better outcome for the person. So I think it's common sense, but it's getting people away from the way we preserve our funds and improve our outcomes is to constantly say, can somebody else do that? If they can, we're not going to do it. And that has been the culture. And so you get into a deadlock. And the people with disabilities don't get what they need. So they end up being kind of ping pong balls in the middle of this. And they give up and they walk away oftentimes, and they aren't successful. And then the little bit of money each system might have been willing to invest gets wasted. So I think it's really making the case that smart investments get better outcomes. And if you cost share, you can expect the other system to participate with you, and for there to be a reasonable division of responsibility. In every state, that's different in terms of how they agree on what's that reasonable division of responsibility. But just being willing to have that conversation and move to a place where that's how they're operating is why I do the work.
When it works and it all comes together, great benefits, better outcomes for people with disabilities. Can you make this even more understandable and talk through one state example, perhaps, that you've worked in, so that, and again, before you used a youth in transition, but make it even more real and understandable at a systems level and at an individual level?
So I guess I would talk about Tennessee. I spent a lot of time working there and helped them create what I think was the first waiver in the country that was totally focused on, putting employment first for people with disabilities. But they embraced the idea when the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act came out to actually have an MOU between the Medicaid agency and the vocational rehabilitation agency. Really, you couldn't find those types of MOUs in the country. And what they did was hammer out payment responsibility, hammer out a end-to-end process for a person with a disability, which basically said, we can meet people wherever they're at in their journey toward employment or into career advancement. We can meet them where they're at, and we can discern who has responsibility at which point. So, for example, we introduced a service called Exploration on the Medicaid side, knowing that a lot of people never made it to vocational rehabilitation because they never really had a chance to make an informed choice about employment. So Medicaid took responsibility for that, and then also took responsibility. People weren't sure about what they were best suited for to fund a service called Discovery. And then there was the handoff to VR, while Medicaid continued to provide services to people. So the MOU really laid out the process, the responsibility for paying, so that it was a fair division of funding and commitment. And then they did training, and they didn't just provide a recording or something like that. They got VR counselors and support coordinators on the Medicaid side in the room together and trained them side by side, and facilitated a lot of discussions, created a lot of tools that they could use to communicate with each other, and really did try very hard to make sure that those lofty goals in that MOU actually ended up being implemented in practice.
You mentioned in response to one of the earlier questions, we're in a very unique set of circumstances now. We have very low unemployment, which leads to still right now millions of jobs across market sectors available. all different types of skill levels, all different types of industries. If there was ever a perfect scenario for employers who are now looking at any possible way to fill vacancies, support skills development, it's certainly in current market conditions. How does your work on systems change and the sequencing, braiding, and blending of resources, how can those concepts bring to bear to bring what employers often question is, where's the pipeline? How can we have more people with disabilities that we can consider for being part of a more diverse workforce?
So I think system collaboration is incredibly important because no single system knows all the people with disabilities who are out there who are not yet in the workforce. When systems collaborate, systems can jointly find and engage so many more people with disabilities that could be part of the workforce. So the whole focus on braiding resources begins with a joint effort around the population and access to a population. Oftentimes, the Medicaid system, the Social Security system, they know who folks with disabilities are. They know who's not in the workforce. And to get those other systems that leverage resources specifically to support employment to be able to share information, sometimes that's the first step in braiding resources and developing joint collaborative approaches to supporting people, because otherwise the systems that put people to work never encounter or can engage with a lot of people with disabilities who could be in the workforce.
Some of our systems are very short-term. Some of the systems have the ability to do ongoing support for years and years and years. I would suspect that that's at the heart of this is each agency with different levels of funding has different requirements, but when put together, we're going to achieve what any of those agencies can't do separately. I'm curious from an employer standpoint, is there a way for an employer to be a part of this equation?
So I think that's the future. I think the future is developing the partnerships with employers that are not just about hiring and working with the agencies to do that. I think employers want to take much more responsibility for their own recruiting, their own hiring, their own training and support of people with disabilities. And when we let employers do that, when we stand back and say, how can we help you do this yourself? We see much better long-term outcomes in employment for people. You know, the old saying, people with disabilities are last hired and first fired. Well, a lot of that is because we put systems in between, and the people haven't always been fully part of the workplaces where they work. That really falls on us to change our approach and to see employers as full partners, and frankly, to get out of the way when they have their own methods to onboard someone, train them, and help them be successful.
For individuals with disabilities who each generation, I think, is really more empowered than the previous one based on changes in culture, changes in policy, what our world looks like. Is there a way for individuals with disabilities to be more empowered and part of these processes in terms of the systems change that you're working on?
So I think there needs to be, and I think about the concept of self-direction and where that has developed. Cash and counseling, it's been referred to as different things in this country and in other countries, but self-direction really says you are developing your own outcome and your own plan. There are ways for people to do that in the Medicaid program, in the vocational rehabilitation program, but they tend to be pretty hidden and not fully supported. Yet you see individuals and the people around them, the natural people, their families, perfectly capable of finding their own job or identifying employers for which they would be a good match and they would want to work. I don't know how many people I've seen who have gone and gotten their own job, sometimes because they're frustrated by how long the system is taking to respond to them. And then we still see systems that aren't sure how to react to that somebody has defined their own employment outcome, has found a willing employer and needs some supports to go ahead and take that job. I've had that experience. My own son is a vocational rehabilitation supported employment guy. He's 18 years old. But we have struggled with that because he's gone out and said, I want to change jobs, and he's gone and found his job. And then he said, I need supports. And it really threw the system for a loop. And so I think we need to start recognizing that people can find and get jobs in a variety of ways. And the system still needs to be able to respond where they're at with what they need, rather than suggesting that they have to start at the first step and go through a whole process, and the system will decide when they can, get and take a job.
For our listeners, I know it's always dangerous to point out, hey, these are the best states. I won't ask you about these are the states who just seem to struggle and struggle and struggle. But in terms of examples of states where you really see over the past 5 to 10 years, significant progress being made and perhaps have reached beyond sequencing to braiding and blending of resources, who's your short list?
Wow. Well, I don't want to offend anybody by failing to mention them, but I still believe what I saw happening in Delaware. Arguably, some say because the state's so small, everybody knows each other, but nonetheless, the leadership there has always seemed to be on the same page, working together. Maryland, overcoming some barriers to, making people dual eligible for vocational rehabilitation and Medicaid at the same time. Wonderful example. I think Tennessee has pushed the envelope on what will it take to leverage multiple systems to get people employment. My own state of Wisconsin, I guess I would say they've done a lot with, we have now paid coworker supports where the employers can be paid for providing supports naturally. That exists in both the Medicaid and VR systems, and I'm a huge fan of the potential of that. My own son is employed using that model. I think Michigan's come a long way at the local level, figuring out relationships for very, very much for the first time, but they are doing well. And I'll go back to Iowa. I really feel some of the resource sharing agreements that Iowa worked out back in 2015 were glowing examples of cost sharing and being really clear with the field about how you braid resources together.
A great list. Apologies to tomorrow. You'll think about another 2 states, but a very good list. As we look ahead over the next 5 years, neither you nor I have a crystal ball, but what changes do you think will continue to occur that really will give this ecosystem, employers, service providers, policymakers, leadership in public agencies, a sense of optimism that we can go further and we can go faster, and the results are going to be better economically for people across the range of significant disabilities and others. What do you think about?
Well, I very much hope that the driving force here is the employers and the business and industry in this country who begin to recognize more that people with disabilities are capable of contributing to the workforce and being valued employees, but that they are blocked at every turn in a way by the systems that are supposed to be providing them supports. And I don't mean to be very harsh here, but I think we all have to think about how much the workforce shortage in our country could be helped if we remove the barriers that people with disabilities face. I think every day you're seeing we are getting people with disabilities jobs because their jobs are so plentiful at every level, as you said. But how many times then do we see a person not take more hours, not take a promotion, not take a raise because they're worried about losing essential eligibility for essential services and benefits? We have to pave the way and say, as you work and contribute to the economy, the system will invest more in you, not take things away that you need to continue in your career.
Well, I think a great closing statement back to the policy barriers that are still there. I did think of one other question, and that is, do we have enough empirical research on particularly braiding and blending of resources that can help, whether it's the states or it's even public policymakers, understand how significant a change this is from really fundamental cost sharing in a way that drives change and drives better outcomes. Maybe I come back to that because this is a research center behind this set of podcasts, but wonder from your perspective, are there research questions we should be digging deeper and having empirical evidence? This isn't just a trend. This isn't just because there's this outstanding leader in a state, but structurally, from a policy perspective, here's what's making the difference.
You know this, Michael, we have a lot of case study research. We have a lot of storytelling that, of course, we wanted to hope that inspires, but I don't think we have the kind of research, as you mentioned, empirical research, longitudinal research that really demonstrates the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of braiding and blending. I think for that to happen, there needs to be an opportunity for states to have permission to pilot certain models and to pilot them long enough and across a broad enough group to be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the models, including cost effectiveness. I think that the federal government could support and make grants available, whatever it takes to allow for states to actually demonstrate. I will say there are some states doing some really innovative things, and when you ask them if you can share that, they're worried. They're worried that if they share what they're doing, someone will say you're not allowed to do that. That is the culture that's been around. It really needs leadership from the federal government. I was pleased to see the efforts, the joint communications that came out through ODEP and the Administration of Community Living recently. But that needs to be followed by active support of states to design braided funding arrangements and to implement them with a research and evaluation component.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we'll wrap up here. Wonderful conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. I hope our listeners will have a better awareness and understanding of what can be fairly technical and complex issues, but fundamental to the kinds of changes that are necessary at a state and ultimately at a community level. Thank you so much for your time, and keep up the extraordinary leadership efforts that you're making to drive change across the country.
You've been listening to Let's Get to Work, Reimagining Disability Inclusive Employment Policy, brought to you by the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts.